They called her the mop lady. Not to her face, at least not at first, but in the break room, in the elevator, in the Slack channels that the managers pretended not to monitor. That's what they called her, the mop lady, like she had no name, like she had no history, like she had appeared out of nowhere one Tuesday morning, bucket in hand, and would disappear just as quietly when they were done laughing. Her name was Ruth Ellison. She was 63 years old, and she had been cleaning the third floor of Hargrove & Klein Financial Services. Every morning since, before half those employees had graduated high school, she arrived at 5:47 a.m., which was 13 minutes before her shift technically started, because Ruth Ellison had been raised to show up early and leave late and never give anyone a reason to say you hadn't done your job. She wore a navy uniform with her name stitched in white thread above the left pocket. She moved slowly through the hallways, not because she was lazy, but because she had a right knee that had been bone on bone since 2019. And a doctor's bill she was still paying off from the surgery she'd only half finished before the insurance ran out. She worked anyway. That part, the working anyway, was the part nobody bothered to notice. The first time Kayla Morrow said something truly cruel, it was a Wednesday in March, and the office was in that particular kind of mid-morning chaos that made people forget their manners. Kayla Morrow, 26, associate account manager, fresh out of her MBA program and already wearing it like a crown, was walking fast toward the coffee station when she nearly stepped into the wet arc. Ruth was working across the tile floor. "Oh my God," Kayla said, jerking back. She looked down at the floor, then up at Ruth, then down at her own heels. Cream-colored Italian, not the kind of thing you wore near a mop bucket. "Watch what you're doing. I almost ruined these." Ruth stopped. She looked at Kayla. "I have a wet floor sign right there," she said, pointing. "It's practically invisible," Kayla said. And then, loud enough for her two colleagues behind her to hear, she added, "Honestly, how long does it take? Every morning it's like she just parks in the middle of the floor." The two colleagues, Tyler Brent, 28, and a woman named Jade who would later tell this story in a very different way, laughed. Tyler laughed the hardest. He was the kind of person who laughed hardest when someone else was the butt. Ruth said nothing. She moved her bucket 6 inches to the left, continued her arc across the floor, and let them pass. If you had asked her afterward what she felt in that moment, she would have told you, "Nothing I haven't felt before." Which wasn't the same as saying it didn't hurt. It was more that the hurt had a familiar shape by now. She'd learned to breathe around it, the way you learn to breathe around a bruised rib. The thing about the third floor of Hargrove & Klein was that it had a particular culture. You could feel it the moment the elevator doors opened. A kind of low-grade competitive electricity, people performing productivity at each other all day long. The firm managed assets for high-worth clients across 11 states. The people on the third floor were not the top earners. Those were upstairs, on 6, but they were hungry, and hunger that size needs somewhere to discharge. It discharged, mostly, onto Ruth. Over the following weeks, Ruth collected small cruelties the way a coat collects lint. A coffee cup left deliberately balanced on the edge of a trash can she'd have to reach for. A comment about how it smelled like old lady in here lately. The time Tyler Brent walked past her cart and, seemingly on impulse, knocked a bottle of cleaning solution onto the floor and just kept walking. She heard him tell someone it was an accident. She watched him not turn back. There was a running commentary, too. She heard fragments of it, through open doors, fibrous doors, around corners, across cubicle walls that were shorter than people seemed to remember when they lowered their voices. Why does it take her so long? Honestly, she should have retired 5 years ago. I don't think she even understands what I'm saying. Half the time. Ruth understood everything they were saying. She was, among many things she'd never listed on any form or introduced in any conversation, a woman who had spent 19 years building something, quietly, deliberately, in the margins of days that started before dawn and ended after dark. She had grown up in Baltimore, the youngest daughter of a woman who cleaned hotels for 30 years and taught all her children that dignity was not something other people could give you. And it was not something other people could take away. Her mother had repeated that so often it had ceased to be advice and become something structural, a beam inside Ruth that held, even when everything else around it swayed. She held it now. Kayla, for her part, was not a monster. This is the uncomfortable truth about most people who do monstrous things. They are not, in full, monsters. Kayla called her mother every Sunday. She volunteered at a literacy program on alternating Saturdays. She genuinely believed she worked hard and deserved the things she had, and from inside her own perspective, that belief was not unreasonable. She had worked hard. She did deserve good things. What she had not examined. What nobody on the third floor had examined, because examining it would have required them to hold still for a moment in a place that didn't reward stillness, was the cost of her carelessness. The distance between I didn't mean anything by it and it didn't mean anything is vast, and most people who live in that gap never look down. Kayla lived in that gap. In April, a new kind of cruelty emerged. Organized sport. It started when someone, Ruth would never know who, though she had a strong suspicion, began a game the team called the slow motion relay. The premise was simple and stupid. You waited until Ruth was cleaning the kitchen. Then you went in to get coffee. Then you moved as slowly as humanly possible to get in her way, narrating your own movements in a lazy drawl. Oh, reaching for the mug now. Taking my time. While your colleagues watched from the doorway, covering their mouths. The goal was to see how long you could extend her cleaning time. Tyler Brent held the record at 11 minutes. Ruth cleaned around them. She moved her bucket. She waited. When they finally left, she finished the kitchen, wrung out the mop, leaned against the counter for 30 seconds with her eyes closed, and went on to the next room. 30 seconds. That was all she gave it. She had learned long ago that giving it more than 30 seconds was giving it power, and she was particular about what she gave power to. What none of them knew, what no one on the third floor or the fourth or the fifth had reason to suspect, was why Ruth Ellison was there. The answer was not simple, and it was not what anyone would have guessed. 12 years earlier, Ruth's daughter, Simone, had been a junior analyst at Hargrove & Klein. 24 years old, sharp and fast and full of ideas, the kind of employee that good companies notice and bad companies lose. She had spent 18 months on the third floor before supervisor. Not anyone still at the firm. Thank God. Or, this story might have ended differently. Had pushed her out for reasons that had nothing to do with her performance and everything to do with the fact that he found her opinions inconvenient. Simone had filed a complaint. The complaint had gone nowhere, and Ruth, who had raised Simone alone from the age of 7, who had worked 3 jobs across 2 decades to give her daughter the educational foundation that landed her at that firm in the first place, had listened to her daughter cry on the phone for an hour and then hung up and sat in the kitchen of her small apartment in Silver Spring and thought for a long time about what to do with anger that had no legal outlet. What she had done, eventually, was channel it. She had started small, a community organizing role, then a seat on a nonprofit board, then a partnership stake in a small financial literacy organization that operated out of a church basement in Southeast D.C. She had been quiet about it. She had never been the kind of person who needed the room to know her name. By the time she was cleaning the third floor of Hargrove & Klein, Ruth Ellison was a co-founder and majority stakeholder in a consulting firm that had, in the previous fiscal year, acquired a 22% equity stake in Hargrove & Klein's parent holding company. She had not come to the third floor to clean. She had come to see. She had come to understand, from the inside, what the culture of this place actually was. Not the culture described in the employee handbook, not the culture presented in the DEI report, but the culture that lived in the way people treated a 63-year-old black woman with a mop when they thought no one important was watching. What she found had not surprised her. That was the saddest part. The board meeting was scheduled for the second Tuesday in May. Ruth had been on the third floor for 11 weeks by that point. She had documented what she needed to document. She had seen what she needed to see. She had kept a small notebook in the breast pocket of her uniform. Not because she needed the evidence. She had other forms of that, but because writing things down had always been how she made sense of the world. How she transformed experience into something she could carry without it crushing her. The morning of the board meeting, she arrived at 5:47 as usual. She cleaned the kitchen, she cleaned the hallway. She mopped around Tyler Brent when he came in early, and stepped deliberately through her wet section without looking at her, leaving footprints she would have to redo. She redid them. She said nothing. At 8:30, she wheeled her cart to the supply closet at the end of the hall, changed out of her uniform in the small bathroom adjacent to it, and put on the clothes she'd carried in a garment bag hung behind the door since Monday. A charcoal blazer, pressed trousers, a white blouse her daughter had given her for Christmas. She took the elevator to the 6th floor. There are moments in any institution when the temperature changes. Before anyone understands why, the 6th floor conference room had that feeling at 8:52. When the board members were still arranging themselves, still reaching for water glasses and checking phones, still doing the ambient social performance of people who consider themselves important. And the door opened, and Ruth Ellison walked in, the firm's managing director, a man named Charles Whitfield, who had been at Hargrove and Klein for 20 years and prided himself on his instincts, looked up. Something landed in his chest before his mind had processed what he was seeing. He didn't know why yet. Ruth set her notebook on the table. She pulled out the chair at the near end, not the head of the table. She hadn't reserved that. There was no need for theater, and she sat down, folded her hands, and waited for the room to settle. It took longer than usual. When Charles finally said, "I'm sorry, can I help you?" the automatic, slightly impatient "can I help you" of a man who has never once meant that phrase. Ruth looked at him with a steadiness that, later, more than one person in that room would describe as the most unsettling thing they'd ever seen in a professional context. Not threatening, not dramatic, just absolute. "My name is Ruth Ellison," she said. "I'm a co-founder of Ellison Ward Capital Partners, and as of last quarter, we hold a 22% stake in this company's parent entity." She opened her notebook. "I'm here because I've spent the last 11 weeks on your third floor, and I'd like to talk about what I found." The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. Charles said, I'm sorry?" "The third floor," Ruth said. "I was the woman cleaning it." The third floor heard about it. At 11:45, when the managing director's assistant walked in with a look on her face that people would later compare to someone who has just witnessed a minor natural disaster from a safe distance, stunned but intact. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Word moved through an office the way water finds cracks, fast, inevitable, following the lines of least resistance. By noon, Kayla Morrow knew. She was standing at the coffee station when she heard, and the coffee cup she was holding stayed suspended in the air for a full 3 seconds before she set it down with extreme care, as if any sudden movement might make things worse. She thought about the morning with the mopped floor. She thought about the things she'd said loud enough to be heard. She thought, with a specific and nauseating clarity, about the slow-motion relay game and the fact that she had laughed from the doorway at least twice. Tyler Brent, who heard the news in a different way from a different colleague, went very quiet. He was a person who had always privately believed that consequences were something that happened to people who weren't careful enough. He was reconsidering this. The other faces on the third floor wore various versions of the same expression. The look of people who have been caught doing something they knew, on some level, was wrong, and had told themselves wasn't worth examining, and are now being asked to examine it with an audience. Ruth did not fire anyone that day. This surprised people. Later, when the story spread, which it did, in the way that stories about justice have always spread, Because people are hungry for them. Because people need to believe they're possible. People expected her to have marched back downstairs and cleared the floor. That would have been the satisfying version. The version with the clean ending. What Ruth did was more complicated and more lasting. She requested an independent review of the third floor's management culture to be conducted by an outside firm with no existing relationship to Hargrove and Klein. She requested that the review include interviews with all cleaning, facilities, and support staff, not just management. She requested that the findings be presented to the full board, not summarized in an internal memo that would live in a drawer. She also requested, specifically, that Tyler Brent and Kayla Morrow and the 4 other employees whose conduct she had documented be required to participate in a restorative process. Not a legal proceeding, not a termination, but a process. Sessions with an organizational psychologist, a structured acknowledgement of what had happened, an opportunity to do something harder than losing their jobs, which was understanding why it had mattered. Firing them is easy, Ruth told the board. It's clean. It removes the discomfort for everyone. But the problem isn't those 6 people. The problem is the floor they were able to grow on. I'm less interested in the weeds than in the soil. Charles Whitfield, who had been managing a large financial institution for 2 decades and had sat through thousands of presentations, would later tell his wife that it was the best board meeting he'd ever attended. He didn't say it proudly. One more thing happened, 2 weeks after the board meeting. It wasn't widely reported. It didn't make the rounds in the same way. Kayla Morrow requested a meeting with Ruth. It took 3 emails to get it. Ruth's assistant, a measured young man named Tobias, who had worked with her for 4 years and had long since learned not to be surprised by anything, had initially suggested they decline. "You don't owe her anything," he said. "I know," Ruth said. "Schedule it anyway." They met in a small conference room at Ruth's office, not at Hargrove and Klein. Kayla arrived 5 minutes early, which Ruth noticed. She was wearing less makeup than usual, which Ruth also noticed, not as a judgment but as a data point. Kayla sat down and folded her hands on the table and seemed to be having difficulty with the first sentence, because she had clearly rehearsed it and was now finding it inadequate. Finally she said, "I've been trying to figure out the right thing to say, and I don't think there is one." Ruth looked at her for a moment. "Then don't say the right thing," she said. "Say the true thing." What followed was 40 minutes that neither woman would describe in detail to other people afterward. What could be said about it, from the outside, was that Kayla left with red eyes and a straight spine, and Ruth watched her go with an expression on her face that was not warm, exactly, but was not hard either. It was the expression of a woman who had decided long ago that other people's capacity for growth was not her responsibility to manage, but was also not something she was willing to stop believing in entirely. Her mother had raised her to hold that position, even when it cost something to hold it. Simone heard the whole story at dinner, 2 weeks later, at a restaurant in DuPont Circle that Ruth had been to exactly once before and had already decided to return to. Simone was 36 now, running her own small advisory practice, and had the specific kind of composure that belongs to people who've had to develop it early and learn to wear it comfortably. She listened to her mother tell the whole story, the early mornings, the mop, Tyler Brent and his deliberate footprints, the slow-motion relay, the boardroom, the charcoal blazer. Without interrupting, and when it was done, she sat with it for a moment. "You could have just sent a letter," Simone said finally, "to the board. You could have made them respond without ever setting foot on that floor." "Yes, yes," Ruth said. "So why didn't you?" Ruth picked up her water glass. She looked at the light coming through it. She thought about a 63-year-old woman in a Navy uniform, arriving at 5:47 every morning, moving slowly through hallways that didn't see her, collecting small cruelties in her breast pocket beside a small notebook. "Because a letter," she said, "describes a problem. 11 weeks tells you whether a place is capable of becoming something different." She set the glass down. "And because I wanted to know not wonder. Simone looked at her mother, the way children sometimes look at parents when they suddenly see past the familiar face to something stranger and older and more resilient underneath. And, Simone said, "Is it? Capable?" Ruth thought about Kayla Morrow, leaving with red eyes and a straight spine. She thought about the young woman named Jade, who had been at the coffee station that first Wednesday, and had, in her review interview, been the only one on the floor to say, "I should have said something, and I didn't, and I've been thinking about that every day since." She thought about the soil and the weeds and the difference between the two. "I think some of it might be," Ruth said. "We'll see." She picked up her menu. The restaurant was warm. Simone was across the table. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary Tuesday evening, full of people who had no idea what had happened. In that boardroom, or on that floor, or in that small conference room, where a young woman, in less makeup than usual, had tried to find a sentence that was adequate and been told to find a true one instead. Full of people who went home every night to buildings that were cleaned by people they had never looked at squarely. Ruth ordered the salmon. She left a 40% tip. She always did.